Ladies and gentlemen, I think for 99% of people out there watching this video, money brings you some level of stress. I mean, how can it not? Because in many ways, our entire lives revolve around money. We need it to have a roof over our heads, to keep our bellies full, and to pay bills. And when we don't have it, our entire lives start crashing down. There's a lot of stress that comes with money, and I think a lot of that stress comes from the uncertainty of life, the uncertainty of losing your job, the uncertainty of economic downturns, or the uncertainty of this unfair system that we're living in that is composed of few winners and many losers. And with all this stress that money brings in our lives, I find it extremely important to develop coping mechanisms so I don't lose myself in this world that revolves around money. And in this video, I want to share 6 of those coping mechanisms that allow me to deal with financial stress in uncertain times. Now, my first coping mechanism is keeping my expenses low. So perhaps my biggest coping mechanism for dealing with all that stress that comes from money is living a lifestyle that doesn't cost that much. In my own life, I don't have any debt, I don't have a car payment, and my rent is very low. On average, I spend $2,500 a month. Whereas other people have much higher living expenses, where they have a big house, an expensive car payment, and many bills, and might spend $10,000 a month. And in my opinion, living a more frugal life where I keep my living expenses low leads to a lot less stress, because if some catastrophic financial event happens, my lifestyle is very affordable and easy to maintain, whereas the expensive lifestyle is not as affordable and easy to maintain. Life can be extremely unpredictable, but knowing that I don't need that much money to sustain my lifestyle gives me this extreme peace of mind that if something bad happens, life is not going to hit me as hard because I don't need that much money in order to live my life. Now, my second coping mechanism is having a financial safety net. Another thing that gives me an extreme peace of mind despite being in uncertain times is having a very large financial safety net. For me personally, I have an emergency fund of about 6 to 8 months of living expenses and investments of about 1.5 years of expenses. And obviously, I never want to use that money unless there's an emergency. But knowing that I have that large financial safety net in the background gives me this peace of mind knowing that if money stopped coming in or I had a big financial expense, I could use that money to cover me. And in my opinion, I would much rather have some money sitting on the sidelines rather than spend that money on a bunch of nice material possessions, because the peace of mind that money gives me is worth far more than any material possession. And life is uncertain, but it's much more certain when you have this large financial safety net protecting you. Now, my third coping mechanism is taking life 2 months at a time. As someone who is self-employed, one thing that brings me a huge amount of stress in life is never knowing how much money I'm going to make. And oftentimes, when I start to think too far in the future, I go down this dark mental rabbit hole of thinking of all the bad things that can happen. But one way I've learned to cope with this financial uncertainty is just to take life 2 months at a time, where I look at my existing income, and if I can cover my bills and save a little bit of money for the next 2 months, then I don't worry that much. Because beyond 2 months, there are so many unknown variables that I can't predict, but I can predict pretty good what's going to happen 2 months in the future. And if I'm making enough money for the next 2 months, chances are I'll also be making enough for the following 2 months and the months after that. And if not, I examine why, I adjust my lifestyle, and I also have this safety net to cover me if needed. But when I just think 2 months at a time, I never go down this deep, dark mental rabbit hole of thinking about all the bad things that could happen in the future, and I get rid of a lot of unnecessary stress that comes from the uncertainty of the future. Now, my fourth coping mechanism is only focusing on the things I can control. When it comes to money, most things we have no control over. We don't have any control over when the next recession will happen, or the inflation rate, or the next stock market crash. But we often act like we do have some control over these things. And when we act as if we have control, we end up giving so much attention to it, and that creates an extreme amount of stress in our lives. I find that focusing on these economic doomsday topics is a complete waste of time because even if they happen, focusing on them is not going to make your life better or make the situation any easier. And instead, I just focus on the one thing I can't control, my own personal finance situation. Because at the end of the day, that is the only thing that I have some control over. And when I don't focus on these economic doomsday stories that we hear every single day, I have a lot less stress in my day-to-day life. And the thing about these economic doomsday events that we hear about is that most of them never happen. Now, my fifth coping mechanism is perspective. If you watch my channel, you know that I've done a great deal of traveling in my life. And one reason I love to travel to other countries is because you get something you can't really get from being in your own country: perspective. You see how different people's lives are around the world, and oftentimes it puts in perspective of how unfair life is and how small your problems are. For example, in 2015, I was traveling through the country of Myanmar. And on that trip, I went to this train station to buy a ticket. And when I was walking through that train station, I saw something that I will never forget. I saw this newborn baby with no clothes on, sleeping on the floor in the middle of this dirty train station. Due to poverty, a lot of people were living in this train station just sleeping on the floor. And when I saw that, it made me think about how hard of a life that baby has ahead of it, how it is sentenced to a life of poverty that it will probably never get out of. And it put in perspective how small my problems are. No matter how bad things get for me, it will never get that bad. And whenever I get stressed out about money and the uncertainty of life, I always put my problems in perspective and remind myself that a lot of my problems are very superficial. And when I think this way, when I put my problems in perspective, it makes me a lot less stressed out because it reminds me that my bad is someone else's dream. Now, my final coping mechanism is remind myself that it's worked out up to this point. So I am 30 years old, and in my 30 years of life, I have experienced so much stress in a lot of uncertain situations. But what I've noticed is that in every situation, there's this recurring theme that happens where in the end, it always works out. It's never a smooth ride, but what I have noticed in life is that no matter how stressful or uncertain things get in life, every single time, it always ends up turning out okay. My life hasn't come crashing down yet. And I think as long as you give it your best, learn from your mistakes, and don't give up, things will continue working out. And whenever I feel stressed out about all the uncertainty of life, I always look back and remind myself that although in the present moment things seemed extremely uncertain, every single time in the end, they always turned out okay. I must be doing something right. And I don't think that the universe is against us all. And I think if you just try your best, things always find a way of working out. And those are my 6 coping mechanisms for dealing with financial stress in uncertain times. And with that, muchas gracias. Que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.